All right, so we're back.
So,
Part two of Germany. Here we go.
so do I have to do anything?
Oh, just talk. Should be
Okay.
going. Yeah, we're going.
So while we were there, Nancy had some studies done, and we had some studies done because of things, and then
Medical studies?
yeah, mainly because of difficulty getting pregnant. So when in June,
Of 65?
of 65, we had this trip planned to, we went to Scandinavia. So we drove from Hanau up through Germany, Kassel and all those places, Hanover and so on. And we ended up taking a ferry to Denmark from northern Germany. We bypassed Hamburg on that the way up, and then so we spent several days in Copenhagen and saw the sights of Copenhagen. The Little Mermaid, and a lot of interesting buildings, and the cities were quite interesting, and they had a lot of interesting commercial things there because they had interesting furniture systems they had there, the Scandinavian people.
The Danish modern
And
stuff.
and then we took a tour of the city and saw many interesting things. They went at Tivoli Gardens. We spent an evening in the Tivoli Gardens, which is an amusement park. Then we drove up to along the area of Denmark to Helsingør, which was where Hamlet's castle was. And then we took a ferry across the isthmus there. You could see Sweden there. And then we...
So with the car and everything?
yeah, we drove up there.
Is this the Volkswagen Bug you guys had?
That
I've seen
was,
the pictures of you washing.
The VW Bug, which was a nice little car, and then it was economic car. It was small. You could park it in a lot of these cities, and the streets are very narrow. And we took a ferry over to Sweden, and I think one side was Helsingør and the other was Helsingtor. And then we drove up through the area of Sweden to Stockholm, and went through Jönköping, and I forget, there are several other cities, but they had a lot of Lake District there and so on. It was really rather pretty. And we spent several days in Stockholm and saw and Stockholm had a lot of interesting federal buildings or government buildings, associated with the crown, and they had one building was the Three Crowns, and that was the place where they gave the Nobel Prize. That was the Nobel Prize ceremony, and there was a lot of islands in the Stockholm area, and so you could take a boat trip around a lot of these islands, which was really quite interesting. And then Nancy was quite tired during that trip. And of course, at that time of the year, the first part of July, it's light almost all the time.
Yeah.
So then we drove from Stockholm to Oslo, and that was a nice trip. And Oslo is on the Oslo Fjord, and it's another old city. And we were there on the 4th of July, and they had so they had a park there, and they had a statue of Abraham Lincoln. So they had kind of a Fourth of July celebration for all the U.S.
Can I ask why there's a statue of Abraham Lincoln in
I
Norway?
have no idea why it's there, but they have an interesting park there. Frogner was a big statue guy, and it has a huge number of statues in this park. It's hard for me to describe them all, but they all have various stages of people in their development, from young age to old age. And then he's got a tall pillar there, and that's the pillar of, I think, the pillar of life. People are all human structures inside that. It's really quite an interesting park, and a beautiful park.
Yeah.
And their city hall was quite impressive. Now, that's 60 years ago. You know, these cities are quite a bit different now because they're much larger. They have a lot more population and so
Yeah.
on. But the area along the fjords, we stayed in a very nice place, and it was close to one of the major hospitals in Oslo. And they had the Kon-Tiki Museum, and they had the Fram, which is Amundsen's boat that he explored the polar areas. And they had a ski jump area, the famous Holmenkollen, I think it was called. And so we were there, and they have a big concert hall there, and that's where they give the Peace Prize.
The Nobel Prize?
The Nobel Peace Prize. And that's separate from, you know, science and economics and literature
Yeah.
and so on. But to give that. So then we drove from, the problem is that, you know, at 11:30 I took a picture of the city hall with the clock at 11:30, and it was twilight. Well, at 1 o'clock the sun's shining in your window, so you know you don't sleep very well
Yeah. Middle of summer.
in that part of the year. But we drove across Norway to Bergen, and
Which is back in Switzerland?
no,
Or Bergen, Norway still?
Bergen, Norway.
Yeah.
And that was a 2-day trip, and it was really quite nice. There were a lot of waterfalls and rugged country, because there were times when it was one lane, and so when you met a bus, you had to kind of jockey your way around each other and so on. But then we got to Bergen, and Bergen is an interesting city. And so we were wandering around, and of course, you know, well, if you're an American tourist in those days, Americans dressed different than the locals and so on. So this old guy came up to us with a suit. And so he talked to us, and he says, "You're American," and everything. And then he told him a little bit. He had a son and a daughter that were in Washington, D.C. with the Embassy Corps. And he was a retired judge, and he was there as a circuit judge. And he found out I was a doctor, so we went to the University of Oslo, which is Bergen, up on the hill. And that's where Hansen, the guy who discovered the leprosy bacteria, did his work. And they had a funicular up there, and a beautiful harbor city. But he was an interesting guy. And he kind of took us around parts of it. He told us how the Germans captured Oslo with 800 men, and how they were oppressed by the Germans during World War II, because he was that genre. And he was quite interesting. And at 9:30 he said, "Well," he said, "I've got to go to court tomorrow," he says, "so I have to go home, go back to my room." His wife had died about 8 months before that. And then we drove back.
That's pretty cool.
Through a different part of Norway, and we saw the old stave churches. Old Stave Church, the one that was built without any nails, and beautiful old church. And went through a couple of fjord areas and back to Oslo. And then we drove down the coast of Norway, the coast of Sweden, to Gothenburg, and then we took a ferry back to the Jutland Peninsula, which is the northern part of Denmark.
Yeah.
We drove down there, and then we drove back to Hanau, and we stopped at Hamburg one night, which is a big city and had been completely rebuilt from the war. And then we drove back to Hanau, And then we discovered that Nancy was pregnant with Johnny,
Explains the tiredness.
and which explained some of the tiredness and so on. And
Were you guys pretty excited?
well, that was an important thing, you know.
Yeah. Had you been trying for a while?
Well, yeah, I think, you know, the details of this kind of escaped me a little bit. I'm sure your mother would be better on the details because she went through the, you know,
Yeah.
all the gynecological things and everything. So then it was time. Then it was time to move to Augsburg.
So why did you move? Why did they move you from Hanau to Augsburg? Was
Well,
it normal or just?
Well, it was a request of mine, and in that I was in a dispensary and I wanted to be in a hospital because the medical experience would be better.
Uh-huh.
So I asked for a transfer, and then they transferred me to the Augsburg hospital.
Okay.
And there were three of us that were, and so we moved to Augsburg, and we lived in an area maybe a mile from the hospital. And Augsburg was a lovely town also, and it had an old city, and historically it's old. And they had parts of it. They had an area called the Fuggerei. The Fuggers were barons in the years before, and you know they owned the land, and they. But they established the first retirement home in that area. So they had this area that was, you had to be a certain age to get in, and it was kind of like a senior citizens place. It was probably the first of its kind.
Like a retirement community.
Yeah, the first of its time, and so that was quite interesting. And it had an old cathedral, had two old cathedrals in the town, in the city hall, of course. And Phil Whitney was one of the other doctors that was there as an internal medicine guy, who we became good friends with them. And we did a number of things. Living in this, we had gone to Garmisch when we lived in Frankfurt.
Which is in the mountains.
Which is in the mountains to go skiing. And it snowed a foot every day we were there. And so we went skiing there. And it was really quite nice. And Garmisch, a beautiful city at the bottom of the Alps there. And then we went to, Augsburg was about 35 miles from Munich, and Munich is a lovely city, and it was in those days too. Even though there were certain gates, you could still see where the bullet holes were chipped out of the wall, but that you can't see that anymore because when you go back now, it's all been patched up. But this was 1965. And Munich was a beautiful city. We went there to Oktoberfest every year. We spent an evening there with that, and then that's kind of a fun experience to do if you're there. They probably in Wisconsin, I'm sure they have Oktoberfest every year too. But
they have them around here too.
But so we spent a lot of time then we'd gone to Switzerland. We went to Switzerland and spent a period of time there. We traveled to Geneva and Zurich and Interlaken and the Jungfrau and the Matterhorn area and the Italian district of Switzerland, and along several of the lake areas. And Lake Constance was not too far. We went to where Neuschwanstein is, the castle at
the Disney castle.
Disneyland.
Disney's based off of.
King Ludwig he developed three. He was kind of a crazy guy, but eventually he drowned in Starnberger Sea with a psychiatrist. I don't know what the deal was there, but he built Chiemsee, and he built Neuschwanstein and Linderhof. And those were the three big castles that he had expended a lot of the peasants' money on. And then they had the other area of Germany down there in an area called Berchtesgaden. so we traveled to that area too. Berchtesgaden was probably the prettiest part of Germany because of the mountains and so on. It's right across the border from Salzburg, where they have a beautiful castle and the river, and I think Mozart came from Salzburg, and Beethoven came from Bonn, and they have a museum for both of them in each city. But you know, they had a salt mine you'd go through. We were there for about a week one time in the Berchtesgaden area. They have a lot of hiking areas and so on. This was, I think that was the year before, but then we went skiing in Austria in a little town called Kosen, which is near St. Johann, and they have some beautiful mountains around that area. So we spent a lot of time going to Innsbruck and all these other places.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in addition to going to Switzerland, and so in that area, and then but our travel started to, I remember we went on this one ski trip. Nancy did not ski, but she had a pretty good time. And we stayed in this place, and we went to a ski school and everything, and so it was a week, and we skied. But while we were there, we took the delivery package from the hospital in case something happened. So she was fairly far along with the.
She was pretty pregnant by then?
She was quite pregnant by that time.
Good idea she didn't ski then.
And so she didn't ski, but you know, we were there, so I was there. And but we did that, and then it was quite exciting. She wasn't. There were several times that she thought she might be going into labor, but it was false alarms, and then.
Like, did you take her to the hospital type of stuff?
No,
or
no,
home?
we just stayed home, and it just quieted down. But then one time, she called me, and I was at work. She says, "This is the real thing."
Yeah.
So I went and picked her up, and then.
Were you working at the hospital that John was born at?
And I had been there for probably 7 months. And so I knew all the doctors and everything, and I can't remember. There was a nice guy. There was a gynecologist, and the pediatrician, and so.
So they had even though it was a military hospital, they had a full-time pediatrician.
Oh yeah, they
had
3 pediatricians, and we had 3 internists, and 3 surgeons and an ENT guy, and we had an emergency room crew, and
We have all that.
so it was a well-staffed group.
Yeah.
And they were all quite the doctors were really quite good, I thought. The people I worked with, even though the one guy was a bit of a jerk, but he was quite a good doctor. But
So you went pick Mom up.
so then she delivered him later that night, and that was quite exciting. And so then a lot of our activity kind of decreased a little bit because, you know, Johnny was little and so on.
Uh-huh.
And we didn't travel much. Now, he was born in March, and so Nancy came back, I think in July, when he was small. She flew from Munich to Frankfurt and then to Chicago, and then or somehow she got to Milwaukee. She spent a period of time with her parents and so on.
So did she go up to Two Rivers?
I think so.
So they left in August and went to basically to Two Rivers after a while.
Yeah, and then I left the 1st of September.
So just a few weeks.
Yeah, it was a
Difference
couple.
for a
I
month.
think it was a couple weeks.
Yeah.
And so she spent time with them, and then they came. Then she got on the boat, took the boat from, I think, Milwaukee to Muskegon, Michigan. And I got out, I flew into New Jersey, and then I got discharged from the military, and then I drove the VW.
So they brought the car back with you?
Oh yeah, they shipped it back at the government expense.
Yeah.
I didn't have to pay for that, but I had to pick it up in someplace in New Jersey. I can't remember where. And so then I drove. I slept in the car one night in someplace in Ohio. And then Hank picked Nancy and Johnny up at Muskegon, and they were in Grand Rapids when I got to Grand Rapids.
That's cool.
And then we were
So Johnny was 6 months-ish old at the time? Somewhere in
roughly 6 months
Yeah.
old. And then during that period of time when I was in there, I had arranged to have this job in Denver. So then we drove back to Denver and got reacquainted with Jay and Mary, and then we lived in Denver for a number of years.
How about we
Here.
take a break here now that you've done your world tour, and we'll head on to, we'll start in Denver next time.
All right.
We won't wait a year or whatever we've
Yeah.
waited in between these
You know,
things
it's
this time.
well, there are a lot of other things in Germany I could have talked about, but
Yeah, we gotta.
But you know, one of the things, I've been to Germany so many times since there. Sometimes I can't remember which trip I did some of these things on.
That's okay. Well, here I'm gonna say goodbye to everybody,
Okay,
Dad.
okay, take care.
All right, we'll pause you here.
Yeah.